Social Justice Through Sport and Exercise Psychology group. I'm really excited to have been able to hold all three of these and get us together. Sadly, this would have been about the time we would have been getting together in person, and oh, I miss you all. It's been a long year, as we all know. So it's good to see your faces, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Just a couple of things real quick in terms of our group as a whole, something to be thinking about. The founding group got together, and we're also the organizing group got together and had a conversation recently. And we have retirements and impending retirements, and we're getting old and we need help organizing this. So we are seeking nominations, self or otherwise, for people that are interested in joining the organizing group. As we're going to slowly work our way off the group, we want to bring other people in. We know people we'd love to tap, but we also thought, more importantly, we want to hear from you all, who you think should be doing this and who you want. And if you want to be doing this, let us know. We're also thinking ahead as far as what's going to happen, where the symposium is going to be in the future. I'm not saying what year, but if you are interested in sometime in the next couple of years, potentially hosting the symposium, let us know that too, because we can bring you into the loop and start thinking about how to make that work down the road. So we're starting to think a little more forward, and we want your help in doing that. So if you're interested, you can reach out to any of us. You can send me an email, or anybody else on the organizing committee an email, or anybody that you know that knows how to get a hold of us. And we would love to hear from you. With that, I'm really excited to hear this conversation today. So I am going to turn it over and we can get it started.
Okay, thanks, Vicki. Welcome, everybody. It's always so good to see everyone's faces. This is such an awesome group, and I do echo what Vicki said. I miss seeing everybody in person. And last night in our house, we were talking about a word that has come up a lot, which is languishing. It's like this, oh my gosh. So I know a lot of us are in that part of the semester where it's, we're wrapping things up, and we've been in this world, this COVID world for a while. So hopefully this next hour or so is a space where we can just kick back, have a beverage of your choice, and learn from each other. So we have a great panel tonight. We have three panelists, and I will just briefly introduce them. They have great bios, which I'm not going to read the bio. I'm just going to read who they are. You can Google them, but I'm going to go in reverse alphabetical order just because we're bucking the status quo. All right. So our first panelist is C. Lucas. They are an independent scholar, very well known in the NAS circles, and currently working on a number of interesting research initiatives around inclusion with trans athletes and gender. So welcome, C. It's great to see you again. Second panelist is Ann Lieberman. They are a social justice strategist and a sport policy wonk, self-proclaimed, and currently the director of policy and programs at Athlete Ally. And lastly, but not leastly, Erin Buzuvis. She's an associate dean, fancy now, associate dean. Yeah, and professor at Western New England University School of Law. So welcome all. We're very excited to have you tonight or this afternoon, depending on, maybe you're in Europe and it's the evening. But I'm really very eager for this panel. My job is to sort of frame it up and be the moderator and let us hear from our panelists. But very eager for this panel. It really has been motivated by the flurry of bills and laws arising with an attempt to limit trans inclusion in sport, and the attention that has been brought to this issue by the media, by our elected officials, and by the Women's Sport Policy Working Group. So it's currently a hot button topic. I don't know about you, but I'm getting lots of questions about this. And I'm seeking to learn and understand, because this issue has a lot of different aspects: scientific, ethical, legal, policy, human rights, religious, competitive fairness, equity, inclusion, advocacy, and human autonomy. And I'm probably missing some. So we've invited the panelists tonight because they each bring a unique perspective to the discussion. The way that we've structured it is I will sort of pose a question to one of our panelists. They will enlighten us and we're going to bounce off each other, and we'll leave some time for Q&A. So if you have a question as we go, please just use the chat function. I'll be monitoring that. And we haven't pinned the speakers. We're not being that fancy. So if you want to see the person speaking, click the speaker view in your upper right-hand corner so you can see them talking. You don't have to scroll through your squares. If you want to share resources, just throw them in the chat function. We've been compiling those with our last couple conversations. And I think back to Tanya's talk that she led us on racial inclusion. This is a brave space. We're all learning about trans inclusion, and we have different perspectives. Maybe we share similar perspectives, but I really invite everybody to let's have an insightful and respectful conversation tonight. So what I'd love before we get going, or while we're getting going, is just in the chat function, what is the one thing that you're hoping to take away tonight? What are you wondering about with trans inclusion? You know, what's on your mind? And I think it's really important to center the experiences of trans individuals in this discussion. So we're going to kick it off with C. I'm going to invite them to share their lived experiences as a trans person navigating sports spaces. So C, can you just walk us through what you're thinking about, what your lived experiences are right now to kick us off?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to sort of echo, it's great to see everybody. I'm happy to be here, happy to spend this time with you. And yeah, I think the sort of thing that I want to say up front, right, is that of course I can speak from my own experience, and that, trans people as a whole are very different, right? We have lots of different experiences. And so like I come from a very particular perspective, which I think will become clear as the conversation goes on. And so while I have strong feelings about, things, I also recognize that like for other trans folks, that's going to be different. And so I guess with that said, here's sort of my experiences of playing sport and being in sport and being in different sports spaces, right? And so I'm going to go purposefully in non-chronological order, because that is part of the sort of expected trans narrative, is that like you start when you're 3 and then, you kind of go through, right? And so I'm actually going to start right now. And so one of the things that's happening for me right now is I'm like not actually doing any sports, right? With COVID pandemic, I recently moved to Ithaca, and that happened, and then the pandemic happened. And so like, I haven't really made many connections here yet in terms of like sporting spaces and things like that. And so one of the things that has happened is our running club has created this like year-long challenge, and they have like 10 different routes around town that you can participate in. And of course, there's things about time, right? So like you log your time, and there's a leaderboard that's online that you can look at. And part of that leaderboard is they have like age and gender graded, like times, right? So theoretically, they have some algorithm that's like comparing us all based on, some magical computer thing that's going to tell us like who has the best time for like who they are as a person based on their gender and their age, right? And so I am the only person in the M/F category, which means also like I don't get a grade because the algorithm doesn't know what to do, right? And so that's fine with me because I'm here because I want to run in Ithaca. I want to, track my own times. I think it's kind of fun to interact with other people on the forum, but like if that was important to me to like do some sort of competition, like if the competitive piece was important to me, there's no way for me to do that, right? Like I'm by myself. I'm very clearly like visibly by myself, right? On the leaderboard, like I don't even come up on the leaderboard because the leaderboard is like men, women. And so like you have to like dig around in like the overall standings to even find me. And so like while I appreciate the sort of category of M/F, right? Like I don't have to pick one or the other, which is what usually happens in running races, right? But still, like, I mean, okay, like you tried, thanks. Also, like, how do we maybe want to structure this differently? What are some other ways we might structure this? And so I think that is sort of like a common theme that runs throughout all of my stories, all of my experiences is like, nobody really knows what to do with me because, at different times in my life, I've looked more girlish. At different times in my life, I've looked more boyish, and so like, I've always kind of played sports that I wanted to play and, my friends were playing. And so that's what I did, right? Like, I played football in high school and everybody made a big deal about how you're the girl on the football team. It's like, I mean, I guess, maybe, I don't know, sure, right? And so then kind of these ebbs and flows of like playing on boys teams, playing on girls teams, doing things that are totally individual, that are in like co-ed sort of gendered, non-gendered, gendered spaces, right? These spaces that are like trying to make an effort, but still it's really hard, right? Like with what we have set up for ourselves in our culture, it's really difficult because sport is based on sex segregation, right? The whole concept that we have of what sport is and how we sort of frame it is based on this idea that men and women are so drastically different, they can't possibly compete together. And so that makes it difficult for me, who's the person who, I sort of am gender fluid, gender queer, right? Like as the kids these days are saying, probably non-binary, right? For me, I think it's a space that like I just don't even fit, right? Whereas for other trans folks, obviously if trans girls want to play with girls, trans boys want to play with boys, so that's sort of a different conversation. But I think there is something to this idea of like we're sort of based on how people read us and understand us and all kinds of assumptions that are placed on us as we're kind of moving around trying to navigate these spaces. And so I think I'll sort of stop there so that we can get the conversation going. But I think that's where I kind of want to start, right? Is like the sort of crux for me of the issue is like, we don't even know how to handle this. And so maybe that's an opportunity to be creative with how we might set some of these things up.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks, Sia. I appreciate your thoughts and openness and authenticity and helping us think through that and helping me learn. I certainly, as soon as you said like, oh, not all trans people have the same experiences, I'm like, speak for all trans people, please. I certainly didn't mean to do that. But thanks for gently reminding me and everybody else, because this is fluid and it is incoherent. This is why we're doing this tonight is to learn. And I appreciate everybody's comments in the chat function. A lot of just practical questions about what do we do? How do we talk about this with our colleagues, with our students, with your in-laws, if you're in my situation on the golf course when, people are, oh, what do you do? Oh, I teach sports science. Oh, well, what do you think about trans athletes? I'm like, I'm just trying to golf. Can we just like, do I use that as an opportunity to educate or do I just push them back? So, Anne, can you speak to, for those who are not familiar with Athlete Ally, first tell us what Athlete Ally is, and then some of the things that you're doing right now in this space, if you will.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for allowing me to pinch hit for the incomparable Anna Baith. It's lovely to meet many of you, see some of you again. So thank you. Athlete Ally works to end homophobia and transphobia in sport and to activate and educate the athletic community to use their platforms to really create change in sport. And so I think most of you are probably familiar with our work as it relates to the Athletic Equality Index, but we have a really robust education program, sport policy program, and of course, athlete activism program. So a lot of the work that I've been doing really since I started with Athlete Ally in 2017 is building educational programs, not only around LGBTQ plus inclusion in sport, but content specifically about trans and non-binary athletes. And so of course, we've seen a massive uptick in this in the past 2 years. And so we've partnered with Chris Mosier to create a series of trainings for a number of different audiences on trans inclusion in sport. So one that's more of a baseline training, making sure everybody's on the same page about language, the history behind attacks on trans folks in the US and globally, and trans athletes, a primer on trans sport policies, just kind of the basis, the foundation, and then a 201 training that's really more focused on cultivating allyship. And I think to many of the points that I saw in the chat, what are concrete things that people in different roles in sports organizations, at colleges and universities, on teams, in schools can do to make more inclusive environments for trans athletes. So we've been doing so much work in the legislative space as well this year. And so I can talk a little bit about that as well. Am I able to share my screen? I should have asked about this previously.
Yeah, you're all set, Ann.
Okay, great. I will warn you, I have many talents. Zoom is not one of them, so just bear with me as I try to do this. Okay, so these are slides from the 201 training that Chris and I do, but I wanted to show you this map of the current context. So we are, without exaggeration, facing the worst legislative session in history for LGBTQ plus people. I'm only talking about a snapshot of legislation. This is a very narrow slice, which are the trans athlete bans. But to give you a sense of the numbers, we have over 300 anti-LGBTQ plus bills sitting in state legislatures across the country. A third of those are specifically targeting trans folks. Those bills, which I think most of you are familiar, fall into two primary buckets. So the first are the medical care bans, which are trying to deny life-saving healthcare to trans youth. To, again, these bills vary. They criminalize healthcare providers, parents. So they look different depending on the state context. And then of course the athlete bans, which is what we're discussing this evening. So this map is as of Sunday, but pretty soon I think we might see Montana turn yellow. We'll know in a couple of days, and potentially West Virginia will know by Monday. So I can't tell you how quickly this context has been shifting. And a lot of the work that Athlete Ally does is essentially serve as an extra set of hands to state-based organizations who need folks to help constituents write testimony, do message training. Of course, a big part of our work is engaging athletes at the collegiate, at the pro, at the semi-pro, Olympic, Paralympic level to organize against these bans as well and to use their platforms to speak up. But it has been such an onslaught of bills, and it's been very scary because they're moving so quickly, and it's just been so hard to keep up. There are a few slides after this that I think are also really relevant to this conversation. We say this over and over again in our messaging, but this is a solution in search of a problem. Lawmakers in these states can't even cite examples of trans athletes. And even when we talk about, we're going to talk about them a little bit later, but the Women's Sport Policy Working Group, they also are not able to cite examples of trans athletes that are damaging cis women's opportunities at elite levels. So it's really a red herring to distract us from other real issues in women's sport that I don't need to tell any of you about, because many of you have dedicated your careers to researching and trying to combat those inequities. The other piece is these bills are incredible government overreach when we see governing bodies at all levels trying to put together inclusive policies for trans athletes. I, an athlete ally, we have particular opinions about what makes a policy inclusive or not. Some of the messaging we've been using in the movement is to pivot back to talking about policies that we don't think are perfect, but they're a better thing to pivot back to rather than these horrific athlete bans. So this has been challenging for us as well to not fully support certain policies, but know that they're a better alternative than banning trans kids from playing sports with their friends altogether. And then the last piece, and I just have loved Breonna Turner's entire Twitter thread. So these came out, of course, when we saw the incredible discrepancies between the men's and women's basketball tournaments, which didn't surprise me. I'm sure it didn't surprise several other folks on this call. But when we talk about the actual evidence and research that's talking about the challenges that face women's sports, girls' sports, trans athletes are not a part of that research because trans athletes are not the problem. So we're also really trying to pivot the conversation away from trans athletes to say, oh, this is so interesting. Do you care about women's sports now? Great. Let's talk about Title IX compliance. Let's talk about sponsorship opportunities. So that's another piece that we're seeing quite a bit. And then the last piece, and if you haven't watched Kai's testimony, it's so wonderful, but sport is just being used as a very particular strategy and agenda and trans folks were being used as a wedge issue yet again. And it's become a very compelling wedge issue. And again, at the end of the day, we're talking about kids that want to play sports with their friends. And we can of course, have conversations about elite level sports, but these in the 30 states, the 31 states that were fighting these bans, it's about kids. And so we always try to bring the conversation back to what is going to be the impact and the reality on the ground. So I know that was a lot, but I just think the visuals are helpful.
Great. Thanks, Anne. And I think that's a nice segue to Erin, who's maybe our most senior legal expert in the group tonight. And then we'll come back to talking about some specific strategies that all of us might be able to employ or use. So Erin, can you speak about the legal context?
Yeah, that's all you need to say, Nicole.
Okay, take it away,
Put
sister.
me in. Yeah, so the legal context, I mean, you have to ask the question that broad because there are so many moving parts and so much recent development. Up until just the last year or so, I would have said in response to that question that in terms of the law, in terms of the public law, meaning statutes that state legislatures or Congress has passed or actual judicial decisions, there was not much influence of the public law on policies regarding transgender inclusion in sport. The law was basically lurking in the background, and the majority of actual policy development was being done by high school athletic associations, which are not governmental entities. They're private associations that make up membership rules that their school members have to follow. And sometimes they did so in a nod to, the fact that maybe their state had passed an inclusive non-discrimination law for schools, but for the most part, these state athletic associations were making policies without really needing to connect them to any particular law. So the first example of that was Washington State's policy in 2006, I think was the year. And it was the first high school athletic association policy, and it was the first inclusive policies. So Washington State permitted students to participate according to their affirmed gender without any kind of medical requirement imposed on top of that. And then we had this sort of, we had the golden age of transgender athletic policies when about almost as many as 20 states copied Washington. There were other states that had not quite as good policies as Washington's, maybe had little quirks and twists that left exceptions for unless we think it's unsafe or unless we think it's a competitive disadvantage. But still set, at least as in the language, the default was gender identity-based participation. And then you started to see a couple outlier states that restricted participation based on birth certificates, which was a backdoor way of banning transgender athletes for participation. But it was just a handful of states, and these policies again were not enshrined in state law. So where is the law in all this? Like I said, it was lurking in the background. We've got Title IX, which is a sex discrimination statute. And people have been making the argument for years, but increasingly recently with more fervor, that sex discrimination covers transgender discrimination, that there is a relationship between those two concepts. They're inextricably linked. That if you're discriminating against someone on the basis of the fact that their gender and their sex do not align according to your stereotypes, you are taking their sex into account, and thus it's sex discrimination. So with that argument in mind, the Obama administration in its waning days in 2016 published a guidance document that tried to push state athletic associations towards more inclusive policies. And that was the first time where Title IX was being specifically invoked in this arena. Well, we all know what happened in the political sphere after that. We elected a different presidential administration, which upon taking office immediately revoked that guidance document and replaced it with more oppressive and discriminatory policies against transgender people in all contexts of life, from the military to employment to schools, let alone religious exceptions. You were all there. You know what I'm talking about. So we've got the Trump administration, which is the low point for transgender rights, and Title IX being used now for the first time to challenge high school athletic associations that were inclusive. So that brings in the story about the Connecticut athletes, some track athletes in Connecticut who, transgender girls who'd won a couple of high-profile races and caught the attention of the media, caught the attention of parents of other cisgender girls who argued that that their daughters shouldn't be losing to these transgender girls, that it was affecting their ability to get scholarships, to get recognized, and to move on. And so they brought a Title IX complaint to the Department of Education. They also brought a lawsuit. And the Department of Education was, if we hadn't elected a new president, we would definitely be looking at a situation where Connecticut schools were going to be losing their federal funding because the Trump administration was using Title IX to say that inclusion violates the law, as opposed to the other way around, which had been the Obama administration's tact. So then we have another election and another change of administration. And with that comes a revocation of the Trump administration's tactics and policies. But with that also comes, I believe, a very strong political backlash in these red states and among Republicans who have control of state legislatures to a disproportionate degree, to try to react to Trump's loss and to Biden's win in whatever outlet they can create for themselves. I see this as a backlash to Biden's election. And so they've started the process, as Ann told us, of introducing these bills across legislatures across this. This is obviously a coordinated effort. One of the early states to adopt these laws is Idaho. And that's important because it was the first one, and it's already been challenged in court. And Idaho's law restricts transgender girls from participating in both high school and college sports. So there you have plaintiffs, co-plaintiffs, one who is a college athlete who's a transgender girl. You also have a cisgender girl in high school, because everyone is subject to scrutiny now that you are policing people's gender. So she's bringing the sort of due process privacy argument, and the trans athlete, who's a collegiate athlete, is bringing arguments based on equal protection. And at the district court level, they prevailed. So there has been a favorable judicial decision that says Idaho's law violates the Equal Protection Clause because there's not a strong enough rationale for the draconian level exclusion that law creates. There's currently appeals pending. Who knows what's going to happen at the next step, the federal appellate court. And from there, potentially it could go to the Supreme Court, though usually the Supreme Court waits until there are conflicting views among the circuit courts. So it might be a while yet before this issue reaches the Supreme Court as a matter of equal protection doctrine. So all of these state laws are potentially vulnerable in a couple of ways. First, if that equal protection doctrine, if that analysis prevails, either because the Supreme Court adopts it in the Idaho case or because other federal courts agree with it and adopt it in their own cases when other state laws are being challenged, that could be a way to put some kibosh on some of these oppressive state laws. The other thing that could happen is that the Biden administration, could take a more aggressive stance with Title IX enforcement and say, we interpret Title IX to require inclusion, and any state, any school that's receiving federal funding that is playing by the rules of a state that's requiring exclusion will not receive federal funding. That's the leverage that the Biden administration has if they choose to use it. They could say, okay, no federal funding for you, all you schools in Idaho, all you schools in Mississippi, all you schools in Tennessee. That is a massive political weapon to use. Would the president choose to use such a drastic response on this issue and agree to absorb all the political fallout and consequences from that? That is something that remains to be seen. It's never been done. It's never even been done to an individual school district or college that federal funding has been revoked, let alone on the basis of an entire state or collection of states. But it is theoretically a possibility. It's how you would resolve the conflict between Title IX saying inclusion is required and states saying exclusion is prohibited. I think
Right.
that might be a place to pause.
I'm letting that sink in.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll leave it at that, but I'm sure we'll return to legal questions, and I'll take it in whatever direction the conversation moves.
Okay, I'll give C and Ann another chance to react to each other, to what Erin said before we sort of move on. And I'm making a note of Erin. So really quick, what happens at the Supreme Court then?
With this court? Hi, Mrs. Kavanaugh. How do you feel about transgender rights? I don't know. I feel I was not, but you know what? I was also pretty pessimistic about before the Bostock decision. So maybe there's a surprise 5-justice majority. I would obviously feel better if this case does not go up to the Supreme Court right away. The longer Biden is in office, the greater likelihood that we could somehow get some Biden appointees eventually. I mean, I don't know, I'm not going to predict who's next or anything like that. But if Biden is the president for 8 years, potentially, that is, odds are there will be some Supreme Court nominees within that time that might help improve our chances there.
Okay,
I,
all
I,
right, we
this
can,
would not, yeah, oh, yeah, okay. I'll leave it at that.
okay, C and Ann, reactions, comments?
Yeah, I guess so. For me, as a historian, I think for me, the kind of perspective and the questions that I have are even sort of broadly thinking about like, is state recognition even something that we want, right? And it seems to be like, well, we're sort of forced into this space of, it doesn't really matter what we want, right? And I just feel like oftentimes the way that state recognition works is to sort of very narrowly define transness, right? And that falls into these kind of very medicalized ways of understanding who trans people are, what trans is. And then again, it's the sort of like complicated layering of all of these things where like, when I say state there, I'm thinking like governmental recognition in general. But then if we think about like states, like individual states, the process for being trans in different states is completely different, right? So like if as some of these, like if you're looking at certain policies, right? Like some policies, when they were first getting written, right? Like IOC policy, for instance, like the original Stockholm Consensus, right? Demanded that like you have legally changed your gender, right? And that is a completely different process in all of the different states, right? Like some states it's a little bit easier, some states it's way super hard. Sometimes there's different gatekeepers that you have to go through. Not even to speak of like this idea that like, well, not everybody wants to do that, right? And so of course I know that like the ways that inclusion policies and things like that have been written, we kind of got away from that sort of thing, but that is always there, right? Like as we're thinking about what are the repercussions for people, right? And so if we put all of these things in place, we say, well, you have to have medical, sort of as people call it, medically transitioned, right? Well, like what does that process even look like, right? Like, is it legal, right? As some of these bills are like trying to get illegal to even get care, right? So like, how am I ever going to be able to place for it? Like if I can't even get the care that you're demanding that I take in order to get there, right? And so I think part of it is just, for me, like, what are the repercussions for people as like these things sort of fall out? And so as a non-legal scholar, right, as a historian, that's sort of what I think about in the ways that like we construct transness and like the shifts that we've been seeing in like what that even means, right? Who counts? And so I think I'll kind of stop there. Let Anne, if you have anything to add, and I'll mute myself.
Yeah, that's a really great point about how we define transness and what that looks like in different state contexts, for sure. I think the only thing I have to add is, well, first of all, Erin, that was such a good, succinct overview. I'm really happy we're recording this because I think there's so much has happened over the past 20 years, and it often can be challenging to kind of succinctly piece the policies at the High School Athletic Association to what's happening at the state level. So that was great. So I hope we will get to view this recording afterwards. So I think the interesting piece that I've heard from folks who are litigating some of these cases as well about, around strategy. So do we or do we not apply additional pressure to the Biden administration to actually take a stronger stance? To your point, Erin, about actually saying like, folks, you're not going to get federal funding. So these 4 states have already passed legislation. And there definitely is an appetite to apply pressure, but there's also a fear that if too much pressure is applied too soon, given this incredibly volatile political context, that you will get organizations like the Heritage Foundation and Alliance Defending Freedom, a lot of these really, really awful anti-LGBTQ plus organizations, really that are identified by the Southern Poverty Law Center as hate groups, that they will put forth a case in a particular district court that will then halt everything all the way up until the federal level. So that's been interesting to hear as well. So we're also trying to figure out moving forward what makes the most sense at the federal level, given the volatility of the state context and the fact that some state legislators, especially right now, love that they are just, flipping the bird to the federal government. So we're also in a very particular political context that is constantly shifting. And so strategy is constantly shifting as well.
So we're really just kind of trying to thread this needle, and the needle hole keeps moving. And this is really, like you said, volatile. Erin, do you want to react to that?
Yeah, I mean, isn't that, I just want to acknowledge how horrible it is that trans kids are this political football right now. That this is a debate that's standing in for so much else, but it is playing out, it is playing out on the backs of trans kids, and that we have to sit around and think about strategically, well, do we want to go to bat for these trans kids? Because that might result in even worse things happening politically. I mean, it's reprehensible that that's the situation that we're in, and I don't have a constructive point to end on with that particular point, but I do just want to acknowledge that there is this massive political upheaval and this political crisis that our country is in, and it is playing out on this issue, and it is about kids playing sport, and it just could not be more divorced from what is really being fought over in this country, and it is such an obvious proxy. Sometimes I just can't even believe that we're here.
Right. So one of the things that I would love our panelists and also all of us, because we have a lot of collective knowledge on this screen, and many of you care very deeply about this issue. A lot of the questions in the chat were, how do we counter or refute these damaging narratives that just eat to the core, that are, when we recognize this is just a proxy, and, people are coming at you with these false claims and false narratives, like, trans athletes are going to be the death of women's sport. And, they're talking about male to female trans athletes. So what are some of the common narratives, language, access points that we can all start to use collectively to shift the narrative? So if the panelists want to weigh in, if some of our participants want to weigh in, I'd love to hear some of them, because a lot of you were asking about that.
I can start if that's all right. I think the thing that I've sort of been hearing in a lot of these things, right? And so part of what I have been studying is like, how do trans athletes sort of get talked about in the media when they do appear in the media, right? And so it's almost always like this issue around like fairness and this idea that like somehow trans athletes are cheating, right? And so it's again based on these ideas that like men and women are so drastically different that like men, it's like it's the floodgate theory, right? Like, well, if trans people and all these men are gonna come into sport, blah, blah, it's like again, it's like these arguments that I know why people use them, but like are just nonsensical. And as these kinds of things have been sort of going around, like it sort of taps into this sort of history of understanding trans people as like fakes and cheaters. And that really comes from like the original definitions of transsexuality, like back in the 1940s and 1950s, when medical physicians and doctors and endocrinologists were like trying to create a category for these people who were coming to their clinics, right? was there was this category of the quote true transsexual, right? And that was different than like the pseudo transsexual and the gay man who just can't accept that he's gay, right? And so there's all of these things that are sort of wrapped into this idea of what trans is, right? And so even though, right, we might have different ideas now of like what trans is, that it comes with, right? Like all of the sort of the meanings of those words come with, right? And so part of what I have been seeing, right, is this idea of like, like this posture of like, well, I accept trans women, but they're biologically male, and so therefore I don't want them to play women's sport, right? And so it's this like sort of mental gymnastics of like, okay, well, I'm going to show you that I'm accepting of you as a person, right? But really, right? And so it's this idea of like, well, where does transness even exist, right? Like, is it within me? Is it, like we have this sort of conception of like identity versus body that's really inherent to a lot of trans discourse, right? Like, well, I'm going to change my body to sort of match my mind, right? And so while that seems to be a useful way of thinking about it for a lot of trans people, that also like opens up the space for this kind of discourse where it's like, okay, well, I accept your identity, but really your body, right? And so I just think it's a really sort of disingenuous way to think about it, because biology is not that simple, right? And a lot of times when you hear the people who are like speaking for these entities, like I'm going to pick CrossFit, for example. They had a trans woman who wanted to participate in the CrossFit games several years ago, and the CEO of CrossFit like releases this statement. It's like, well, it's simple high school biology. And this sort of like all to, like the sort of non-complicatedness, right? Like that it really that simple, right? What we know is that it's not that simple, right? That there's chromosomes, there's hormones, right? There's physiology, there's receptors that like may or may not like use testosterone in a way that like makes you athletic, right? And it's sort of this idea that like testosterone is this sort of like magical serum that makes you athletic, which of course is not true, right? And so I think for me to sort of point out that kind of fallacy, right? To point out that like, okay, like this argument that you're making like is really disingenuous, like, so like I see how this is working. And, I think that opens up an opportunity to sort of talk about the complexity of biology, right? That like, we have these two categories, but that's not actually how people exist, right? And so, I've seen that as a way to sort of like an into those conversations that, can sort of counter some of the ways that this gets talked about. And I think I'll stop there for right now.
I'm not sure I captured it exactly right, C, but testosterone is not the magical serum. I think that's roughly what you said.
Yeah, I do have one, just one example of like the way that this works, right? So I have been taking testosterone for, I don't know, 5 years maybe now. And when I go to new doctors, or every time I go to the doctor, right, we have to like redo this conversation about the ways that my body has changed, right? So it's like this sort of like perpetual puberty that like you can never get out of, right? Like transness is this thing that like is never ending, right? It's this frame that like, for some people, right, the sort of goal is I want to pass as, as a man, as a woman, right? But the problem is the ways that the structures work, it's like it doesn't allow you to do that. So I go to the doctor, right? I just need you to write a prescription for testosterone. Like it's pretty simple. I've been in different places where there's like informed consent models. I've been in different places where, that's a little bit more gatekeeping. Here in New York, testosterone is a controlled substance. So every time I need a prescription, I need to go back to the doctor, which is like every month, right? And so it's this ongoing question of like, well, has your voice changed? Okay, well, yeah, okay, my voice has changed. You're getting hair in weird places, right? Yeah, okay. But like, again, we like are picking out these things that like we think signals a thing, but doesn't actually signal the thing that we think signals, right? And so the question that always cracks me up when they get to is like, they like look at my shoulders and they're like, oh, so you've gained some muscle. And I have to be like, well, no, or like, hold on, like those are assumptions that you're making, because this is actually like the weakest I've ever been in my life when I'm on testosterone, right? Like, and so we don't take into account the ways that like all kinds of different things make our bodies do things and be athletic or not be athletic, or, you know, and so I feel like I maybe forgot the point of why I told you that. Oh yeah, magical serum, right? It's not, it's not, right? I didn't insert testosterone and then it just got huge, right?
Right.
It's not.
See, I love that you said that, because I'm very lucky because I can go to Cal Lord in New York, which is just an incredible LGBTQ plus affirming healthcare clinic. And when I first went there and started asking about hormones, it was just like talking about any other thing you go see a doctor for, and it was amazing. But I kept making jokes after my first testosterone shot, like, oh, I'm ready for the Olympics, you know, because that's the mythology around testosterone, that, you know, you take it, certain changes happen immediately. And the reality is it's such a complex hormone that even when you're sitting in the doctor's office and they're telling you about all the things that could happen, it's literally like a laundry list of like, this could happen or this could happen. Sometimes this happens too. Maybe you'll experience this. And it's so funny because it just underscores the fact that, you know, the hormone's incredibly complex. We know that, you know, kind of going back to the talking points, that there is not sufficient scientific evidence to suggest that testosterone is the be all end all of competitive advantage, right? Does that mean that testosterone makes no difference? No, but it means when we're hinging sport policy on this miracle serum, this miracle molecule, it's really problematic from a human rights perspective and from an ethics perspective when there isn't sufficient science to back up certain levels of testosterone. And I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to read this wonderful book by Dr. Jordan Young and Dr. Karkazis. But so often when folks talk about this book, they talk about the chapter on athleticism, which of course is wonderful and talks a lot about exactly what we're talking about here. But the whole book is fascinating because it talks about the way in which, from a societal perspective, we have mythologized tea so much to the point where we think we have common sense understandings of what testosterone does and doesn't do in the body. And so that is very, very dangerous and is undergirding so many of these conversations in the sport policy space. I think something that has been helpful in conversations with lawmakers, with folks in the sport community, is to really bring it back to values and why people play sports to begin with. And that trans kids just want to play sports with their friends. You know, any of us who has had a meaningful experience in sport, it has really rarely been about winning or losing unless we have very elite level athletes here. It's really been about the camaraderie, the skills we develop, the relationships that we develop with our peers, and how important for socialization, for mental health, all of that is for trans kids and for all kids. And then I think the last piece I'll say is really that, again, in my slides, but that there's no empirical evidence that trans athletes and trans women and girls have or will ever take over women's sports. These are the exact same arguments that were being made in Renee Richards' case in the 70s. There's discussion of a mythical trans takeover. We are now in 2021. It still has not happened. Another point that I'll share that I think is really useful is, you know, there has been a policy in place at highest levels of sport, the IOC, since 2003, 2004. There have been over 54,000 Olympians and not a single one has been trans. That is, of course, we can say in this space because there have been so many barriers to participation. But again, there just is not evidence to support that trans folks are taking over sport. The last thing I will bring up anecdotally, and Dr. Semerjan, this was actually from you when we did the panel together at San Jose State, but you played rugby and you are 5 feet tall?
411.
411. And it actually was a perfect setup because we were having a conversation about your research and somebody who you had played rugby against, Phaedra Knight, who many of you probably know because she's now president of the Women's Sports Foundation, who is 5'8", 180 pounds. And I remember you turned and said to the audience, you know, how do we even define fairness? Do you think it's fair that I play against Phaedra? But that was just such a perfect example of the diversity of bodies in sport, and to suggest that women only have a particular way that they can show up in sport, which is of course white, feminine, small, you know, that's all we can from a see to your point about, you know, histories of transness. I think that it's so intertwined with histories of white supremacy in this country as well and globally. But I think also talking about the diversity of bodies is really important because it's such a sexist assumption to suggest that there is a ceiling on women's athleticism, so much that, you know, if a woman is so good at her sport, then she can't possibly be a woman. And that is so deeply offensive to me as somebody who loves women's sports. And so I think trying to center some of those aspects is also really important in debunking so many of the myths.
Yeah, I think just sort of following up on that, you know, I definitely think, oh, yep. Was somebody talking?
Go ahead. See, it's me. I'm back.
Okay. Oh, okay. I was just thinking when Anne was talking there, right, about, yeah, this sort of like one of the hot button things, right, everybody wants to talk to is about this issue of fairness, right? And so like, I'm not even going to get into the arguments about like whether or not it's fair for like trans women to play, but I want us to reframe to even think about like, well, what is fair, right? Just like and Tamar just sort of did, right? Like sport as we play it is inherently unfair. Like that's it, right? Like that's how it works in our culture, right? You know, and so, you know, once we sort of acknowledge that, and then we want to say, okay, well, like we want to make our sports more fair. Okay, well, like to whom is sport going to be fair, right? Like who are going to be accountable to, right? Like, is it going to be the structures? Is it going to be schools? Is it going to be the coaches? Is it going to be the athletes themselves, right? And so thinking about the ways, again, that sport in our culture, and I know many of us teach courses on sport and we have access to folks who want to be coaches, right? Is like, how are we even setting up our teams, right? How are we thinking about sport? What is sport for, right? Like, is sport for winning? Well, I mean, that brings with it all kinds of rules and assumptions and ways that sport is going to sort of carry itself out, right? Like, if sport is not for winning, right? If sport is, as we like to claim, for creating and sort of cultivating character in people, right? Like, well, what kind of character do we want to create? Because the way it works now, we create horrendous people, right? Like, you know, and so really thinking about how might we even restructure sport in general to get us to a place where, you know, everybody is growing and we're learning about the people on our team and we're supporting each other. And, you know, if we win, great. You know, we don't have to like not want to win, but like maybe that doesn't have to be the only thing. You know, and so I think that was one piece, was just like, how are we even thinking about sport, right? And so I kind of want to, I don't have I meant to look up the links, but I forgot to, but so there are a couple places, women's roller derby, rugby, cycling, there are places where groups are creating their own space. They're creating rules, they're creating the types of competition that they want to see, right? And so like women's roller derby has had trans players forever, and they have figured it out, and they have, you know, they wrote their own sort of bylaws and their own ways of sort of dealing with it, right? You know, and so they're out there, right? And so there are other ways to think about it. There are other ways that we might build a sport that is more accountable to the athletes themselves. And then my second point that I do want to just follow up on is that transness is absolutely built within the white racial frame, right? Like there's no way to understand transness without understanding whiteness. And the people who are going to be most affected by this are going to be Black girls, right? We already think Black children are criminals. We already think Black children are older than they are. We already think Black children are like inherently more athletic, right? And so the people who are going to get called on this are going to be Black girls who, you know, are already so disadvantaged, right? And so I think if those are places that we can like reframe, right, and sort of keep the attention on, well, who is this going to affect, right? Like who's going to be most affected by this? You know, it's it's not going to be the team that, oh, boo-hoo, like they didn't win the state championship at high school. I mean, I get that that's, you know, I'm sort of in jest sort of making fun of that. I know that's a big thing for many people in their lives, but like the core of where this is going to affect is going to be the people who are already most affected.
Thanks, C. That's a great segue to thinking about the individuals that are most affected by this. And one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation is that there's a new group formed, the Women's Sport Policy Working Group. Many of you might know of it, familiar with it, maybe you're not. It's formed by some of our colleagues who have long histories of fighting for girls and women in sport. And they have come out with some suggestions. So around trans inclusion, and I've been struggling with this group and their position. But Erin, I'm wondering if you can sort of walk us through, as you do so clearly, what are their primary contentions and what are the implications? And then I want to call on you and Anne and C to say, what does the science say around this?
Yeah, so I mean, so they are obsessed with science, and they have definitely taken, the generalized data that nobody disputes that there are that there are correlations between testosterone enhanced bodies and faster running times and things like that. Nicole asked me to bring this argument into the mix, but I want to make sure that this isn't my position on the matter. I decided I could maybe let them speak for themselves in a way that would be both succinct and fair to them and their side. So I found in their document where there's a visual that I'm just going to share just to give us all something to look at in there, just so in their own words. I mean, I'll preface this by saying they are on the surface saying that they are in favor of inclusion and respect for trans girls as girls, but that they see the need for limits on inclusion in girls and women's sports because of biological differences between natal male and natal female bodies. I think they would say biological, but I resist that word because I think it's possible that gender identity also has a biological basis. I think what they're breaking down here is some attempt at, I think, what they would call a compromise position, that there should be in scholastic sports some differentiation within the category of transgender inclusion, transgender girls and women in girls and women's sports in the scholastic and collegiate context. So I mean, they definitely distinguish out in the first column an athlete who has not experienced male puberty. So included without differentiation, included without conditions, which is I mean helpful to see in print because that's not necessarily what these new state laws are recognizing and exempting that kind of distinction. So, I mean, they are obviously trying to make a point that's more inclusive than the blanket exclusion policies that we're seeing. And then in the second and third column, making a distinction between an athlete who has experienced male puberty and either has transitioned hormonally or has not transitioned hormonally. And there, for an athlete who has not transitioned hormonally, there's some distinction between inclusion without but not head-to-head competition. So I think that might be, I think what they might be describing there is the difference between individual and team sport. And then for athletes who have transitioned, using their hormone status as the basis of their inclusion or not. So consistent with the NCAA rule. So bringing the NCAA rule down to the high school level. Interestingly, elsewhere in this document, they say, look, we're all for where sports is supposed to be recreational and participatory and having other values at stake. We're all for having all inclusion all the time. This is just for the sport that, you know, that matters. But then they're defining the sport that matters as all interscholastic and intercollegiate competition. And so that might be the biggest objection that I make to the scope of their proposal. The idea that when we're talking about interscholastic sports, that should be treated like elite sport, that belongs in the category of competitive, when we're still talking about the sports that kids play. You know, to buy into that distinction that they're offering is asking us to say, okay, what's at stake for transgender kids in school playing sport? What's at stake for them? The very validation of their existence. In some cases, potentially wellness, maybe even life and death. What's at stake for the cisgender girls who would have to compete against this trans girl? Winning a track meet. They are just on such different levels of importance that I just can't even understand how high school sport as a general matter would need to regulate inclusion to this degree, or exclusion to this degree. So I guess I couldn't help injecting some of my own opinions in on this, but you know, this is I think what they're saying, and they are you know, attempting to bolster it with science. There is science, but the thing is, it's not just that there are generalized biological differences. You can drill that and find scientific support all day long, sure, but it's not contextualized. It's not that's my problem. It's not contextualized in terms of what else contributes to competitive outcomes, or what else besides competitive outcomes actually matters as the reason why we have sports in the first place, which is something the other panelists have already said. Maybe I should turn it over to Anne to add on this. I can leave their stuff up, or I can unshare your preference.
That was a great overview. So interestingly, this little chart has shifted quite a bit since they launched, because when they originally launched, they wanted to put trans athletes in a separate but equal third category. So they've been pretty responsive to a lot of the critiques that have come out. And I dropped their new model statute in the chat, which is a brutal 4 pages if you choose to read it, especially footnote number 5. But essentially, one of the biggest problems with this, again, is they're asking for, and this is in the first and just in number 1, they talk about how a student's biological sex shall be established and eligibility determined on the basis of the standard preseason eligibility form, and essentially asking doctors to write down the sex assigned at birth for trans kids, even if they've had their identity documents changed, which is just such a horrific violation of privacy. And it's not the worst version of things that they have come up with, but it's still awful. And it's been really heartbreaking to see so many of these advocates who have done really important work in the gender equity space overall throughout their careers focus on trans athletes, especially given the time we're living through. It feels so callous and unnecessary. And so I think part of what we've been trying to figure out at Athlete Ally is, how much do we publicly talk about the working group? Where we're working with a number of folks in this network here to put together an FAQ document that essentially refutes much of what they're saying, not using their messaging, but so you all will have access to that hopefully in the next, week or 2 weeks. But it's been very important to refute their claims that are not evidence-based and, Erin, to your point, not contextualized, which is really significant. Yeah, but it's been really painful and heartbreaking to see this unfold. And it sounds like it has felt that way for many of you as well.
Yeah, and I think, which again, this is one of the reasons why I want to have this conversation, is for those of us that are troubled or seeking to understand, what is the way that we refute, right? And how do we do that effectively? How do we have a collective narrative that refutes this? And, I think maybe I'm eagerly anticipating this document. So as soon as it's available, please let us all know, because I know many of us are looking for that. So I'd love to just open it up for our last 15 minutes to questions from the group, either in the Q&A or other comments from the panelists. So what do we want answered that we haven't touched on yet?
Nicole, may I go?
Yes, please.
So, see, I was very intrigued about this mythology of testosterone being this magical serum. And I'm wondering, based on your historical perspective, where you think that actually comes from. I mean, is that embedded in our institutionalized patriarchy? Are there other factors that I'm just not thinking about? Like, where has that myth been created from?
Yeah, so I think the history of like hormone research is fascinating and terrifying, and and all of these things, right? And sort of like the scientific study of the human body often is used to serve eugenist purposes, to serve patriarchal purposes, right? And it's sort of a case of, I think, was it Anne who said it earlier, where where we have a solution for a problem that doesn't exist, right? And so we're measuring people to confirm this idea that we already have, right? So we're going to measure people's head size to prove that white people are smarter than Black people, right? And so then, of course, it turns out that that science is not right, And so if we want to think about hormones, right? And so if we think about the sort of history of the way that even we think about sex, gender, and sexuality, right? So for right in our context today, we sort of take for granted, and we probably would teach our students, right? Well, there's sex, then there's gender, then there's sexuality, right? And we say, well, they're kind of intertwined and they affect each other, but, we sort of think of them as distinct categories. Well, that wasn't even a thing until, 40 years ago, right? And so as they're sort of like trying to suss out like, what is sex, what is gender, right? Like gayness and homosexuality weren't really a thing as this sort of concept, right? Of course, people were doing all kinds of fun and funky sex things forever, but like the way that we understand what that means, right, has only existed for like a century, right? And so at first they had this idea that like, well, if you are if you're a woman and you have sort of sex with women and you play sports and you like drive cars, well, you're going to turn into a man, right? So it was this idea of like inversion was the scientific, that was like the scientific theory throughout the 1800s, was that like if women do too much, they're either going to lose, their ovaries are going to fall out and they'll die, or they become men. Those are the options, right? And so then as like 1920s start to roll around, we get these kinds of things where we have folks who you might have heard of like hermaphrodism, right? Like that was a scientific theory that was sort of, again, in the 1800s or so. And they did these experiments on people who we might say intersex, or we might say have, differences of sexual development, right? I know there's different ways that groups who sort of reclaim those words, but at the time they called it hermaphrodism, right? And so they often would like do surgical experiments on these people, right? Like if you had sort of internal testes, we'd take them out, or like maybe we'd insert them and see what happens, right? And so all of these things happening in like the 20s and 30s, trying to suss out like, what are hormones? Like, how do they work? Like what are the effects that they have on bodies? And so, I think we start to see that like they get this idea that like, okay, so we think that there's these two sex hormones, like isn't like all of the cells in our body have them. So like it's not the way that we shape even the way that we think about it, right? And so there was this idea that, okay, well, so testosterone, and then there's why can't I think what's the other one? I'm having a brain moment. Estrogen, there we go. Oh my goodness, I would lose Jeopardy. Oh man. Whew. So testosterone and estrogen, right? And so we have this idea that well, men have testosterone, women have estrogen. It's like, isn't like everybody has both of them, so long as you have like the organs of your body that produce them are working in the ways that produce them, right? And so I think it sort of gets glommed on there in the 30s and the 40s. We start to see this evolution of like this idea that like, okay, well, if inversion doesn't work, and now we have these like gay people, but then there's still these people who like, their bodies sort of look this one way, but they sort of feel this other way, and so this sort of, like I think some of the doctors were well-meaning, right? Like they wanted to help, they wanted to help the people that were coming to their clinics, but the ways that it happened was through this like very narrow categorization of like, this is what this means, this is what this means, this is what this means. And, there's people out there who are like doing good work to question that, but like, I think sort of gets taken up like as a for granted piece of science, and like even scientists. So this is another sort of anecdote, but I think it works to illustrate the point. So I have a friend who is a sort of he was a biology major, and he worked on snail sex, right? And so he like knows all of this stuff, and he knows that like in snail populations, they change sex, like literally change sex in snail populations, but he still can like make that connection to like, oh, maybe human sexual biology is as complicated as these snails that I work on, right? So it's this weird sort of like privileging, sort of like human exceptionalism, and also like, I don't know, just this inability to sort of like get outside of what we think we already know. So I stopped talking.
Thanks, C. I think your historical perspective is really salient here, because a lot of us are not historians, and we forget, speaking of context. What other questions do we want answered before we sign off? Or comments?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go Tips.
So Ed, I was thinking about your comment about how some regulations are not perfect, but at least better than no inclusion. And I actually think I have very strong negative feelings about the NCAA's inclusion policies, and think that they're both transphobic and misogynist. And I think that misogyny seems to underpin a lot of the talk about fairness, like men are better than women. These folks are still men. And that some of what feels like the fight, I have so many thoughts, I'm sorry. Some of what feels like the fight is like what Sue said about competition. Like, if we didn't need competition, we wouldn't care about fairness. Some of it is like, oh, if high school sports weren't the way to get into college, we wouldn't care about high school sports. And then I'm like, oh, misogyny is driving this. Like, and so what do we do as scholars, as folks with like activism ability, like to address the NCAA, which I think people are looking at as a baseline, and I think it's sort of creating a floor that is itself unjust, right? And so like, how do we address the NCAA with their like 3 months on T blockers or estrogen or 3, what is it for trans women? It's something terrible where it's like, you're not a woman yet and you're a man and we think we're going to wreck women's sports. So it's misogynist and homophobic, and we're letting that slide. And I just wonder about your thoughts on like that, the NCAA. How do we burn that down?
Ugh, I have so many thoughts on the NCAA, but we don't have enough time to hear all of them. So the NCAA is trying to take steps to build more inclusive policies. And I think that they want to hear from coaches, from administrators. They are most interested in that audience and folks at NCAA institutions, because when they hear feedback, like Anna and I were part of a conversation with the NCAA and some other folks in the space, and they really were listening to the people who were saying, we want to support trans athletes, we want to support non-binary athletes, we need a better solution. So I think a lot of it is applying pressure from a number of different angles and organizing in the ways that we can. As I think many of you might consider yourself on some level activist academics. So, figuring out, is there an open letter you could send to the NCAA, because I think a lot of it is just going to be continued applied pressure. And I do not, to be crystal clear, I do not like the NCAA policy either at all. It's also just a question of, how do we do the least harm and make sure trans kids are still able to play? And so some of it is, and I used to be totally on the other side of that. I used to be like, no, we have to push as hard as we can for the most inclusive policy all the time, which I believe that, but we do it now 90% of the time when we're faced with an environment like this, where the potential is banning people overall. And so it's very, very challenging. But yeah, I think applied pressure from different angles for the NCAA. I think also, when we look at the Women's Sport Policy Working Group, having folks like all of you in this room who have deep, deep history working in women's sports, such credibility in the field to say, you know what, we don't agree with you. And we are a whole host of academics who've been working for inclusion, and this is the way to do it. So part of what Anna and I were talking about with this document when it becomes public, is it something that also can be like a kind of a sign-on letter, right? So it's like, if you agree with kind of the outline or support this line of thinking, is it something that folks can sign on to? It's kind of like a half-baked idea right now, but so I think that this is a great group to workshop that with and think about, what are steps to take to apply pressure on the NCAA, to apply pressure on the Women's Sport Policy Working Group, et cetera.
I just wanted to add one idea onto that. In addition to everything Ann said, not as an alternative, let's just remember that the NCAA is not some separate entity. It's a membership organization, and its members are colleges and universities. And a lot of us, most of us, work at colleges and universities. So we are the NCAA. I think what that means in terms of leveraging influence and leveraging power is to figure out who is the mouthpiece from your institution on the NCAA. Who is your FAR? Does your president go and vote? Who is voting on your institution's behalf? Find that person. That's a local act that you can take. Bend that person's ear. And if everybody did that, it would be more difficult for the NCAA to cram down the throats of schools policies that they don't agree with. And it's not just about their existing policies, but whether they're policies that are more inclusive than these states that are, Idaho has basically made it impossible for its colleges and universities to be members that would host NCAA tournaments under the NCAA's current rule. What's the NCAA going to do about that? So even if the NCAA leaves its policy where it is, its policy is up here, and the states that are coming in down here, the NCAA could at the very least be pressuring those schools in those states to do better, and pressuring those states to do better.
Might jump in. So, Anne, is there anything that Athlete Ally is proposing as a replacement policy for the NCAA that virtually, I know Tamar's the FAR and I'm an FAR, that we can start to look through with our conferences? I know America East is probably the most active socially of any conference. We're the first to sign on to You Can Play, Spread Respect. We've done, in terms of those kind of things. And I think it has been pushed in large part by FARs. So is there something that we can advocate behind in a replacement, or is there a committee working on a policy that drafts will come forward that we can have some kind of impact on? I'm not going to be the FAR for very long because I'm retiring, but I can certainly push in that direction in terms of that part of it.
Yes, so we have a really fantastic model policy that's a gender identity only policy. And there's that policy, then there's an associated strategy document that Anna and the research team have worked on and that I reviewed, and it's fantastic. So that's definitely something we can share. We're also just in conversation organizationally about how we want to roll that policy out. Next to the AEI, given the current political climate, again, kind of all the conversations we've been having previously, but that's definitely something that Anna can share, because it's a really fantastic policy, and it's a policy and then an associated strategy document and kind of explainer document that's just really not only well written, but it's well researched and well cited.
Perfect. That would be really helpful.
Absolutely.
Yes, that would. Well, I want to be attentive to our time. And I wish we could keep chatting and discussing, because I feel like we're just starting to get going and scratching the surface of having this conversation, but it's been really informative already. I think we've got some good talking points, some good insights. We've got some documents that are coming forth from Athlete Ally. And if you don't read Erin and Chris's Title IX blog, they always have informative pieces there. And I really like this idea of maybe one of the action items of this group is to have a statement, much like Hannah said ASP was coming up with. Maybe that's something, there might be a subgroup of us that's your passion, and we should do that. So as we're sort of moving to SJSEP 2.0, maybe those who are coming on with new leadership, maybe this is an initiative that we want to do. So thank you all for being here. Any final comments from anyone before we sign off?
just thank you all for making the time. And I'm just looking forward to continuing the conversation, and thank you for prioritizing this.
Thank you, Anne, for your work and Anna Bay's work and your entire organization. We're looking to you and your leadership, and Erin to your legal insights, and C for your perspectives and history and keeping us real. It's always good to see all of you who are on this group. This is a special group, and as we wrap up our last conversation of the year, as they're trying times, be well, take care of yourselves, take care of each other. Let us know if we could be of any help. Any of the other founding mothers want to chime in as we sign off for the year?
Just thanks everyone for being here, continuing to support us, and we will be back next year. Don't know where, but we will work it out.
Awesome.